The Wyoming Territory was a land that broke promises and buried secrets. For Sarah Miller, a widow clinging to a patch of dust and memory, it was a prison. Her only neighbors were thirst, grief, and the wolves hired by the Blackwater and Pacific Railroad. They wanted her land, and they were ready to burn her out. But on the deadliest night of winter, Sarah made a choice. She dragged a dying man from the snow, a Cheyenne fugitive with a price on his head. She saved a life and sealed her fate. What she didn't know is that the man she saved would one day return. The silence of the Bighorn Basin was a liar. It sounded like peace, but it was just the open-mouthed waiting of a grave. Sarah Miller knew this. She felt it in the ache of her knuckles as she split firewood, a task that had been her late husband, Jacob's. Jacob was gone 9 months. A stupid, unheroic death, a spooked horse, a bad fall, and a neck broken on the same unforgiving rock he'd planned to quarry for their hearth. He left her with a half-finished cabin, 24 head of cattle, and a deed to 300 acres of land called Jacob's Rest. The name was a bitter joke. The rest was the patch of coarse grass and black mud where Jacob was buried. The land itself was anything but restful. It was hard, stubborn, and, as it turned, wanted. Jacob had been a prospector, not a rancher. He had an eye for topography. He hadn't settled in this shallow basin for the grazing, which was poor, but for the water. The dry creek, which was bone dry 10 miles north and south, pushed itself up through a limestone fissure on their property, creating a deep, cold spring that ran all year. In the Wyoming Territory, water was not just life, it was gold, it was power, it was a target. The man who had his sights on it was Elias Thorne. Thorne was not a cattleman in the traditional sense. He didn't ride the range or sleep under the stars. He was a land agent for the Blackwater and Pacific Railroad, a man who wore polished boots and a suit even in the suffocating July heat. He arrived in the town of Prosperity, 10 miles east, with a briefcase full of maps and an endless supply of Eastern money. His first visit to Sarah, a month after the funeral, had been one of practiced sympathy. "Mrs. Miller," he'd said, standing on her porch and turning his hat in his hands. "A tragedy. Simply terrible. Jacob was a forward-thinking man." He'd paced the porch, his eyes not on her, but on the bubbling spring. This is a hard land for a woman alone. The winters, the loneliness. "I manage, Mr. Thorne," Sarah had said, her voice flat. She kept her hands busy, wiping them on an apron she didn't need to be wearing. Of course. Resilient stock." He smiled, a thin, dry parting of lips. "But progress, Mrs. Miller. Progress waits for no one. The Blackwater and Pacific is coming through this basin. We're bringing commerce, civilization. We'll need a water stop, a coaling tower. You're not building it on my land." Thorne had chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Our surveyors have determined your spring is the only viable source in a 50-mile radius. The company is, of course, prepared to make you a generous offer. $500 for the inconvenience. $500 for the spring that made the entire ranch viable. It was an insult. "The answer is no, Mr. Thorne." His smile vanished. "That is unfortunate. Think on it, madam. The railroad is a powerful friend and a terrible enemy. It would be a shame if complications arose." Complications had arisen. The first was her north fence, cut clean through. Her 26 head of cattle were strayed, scattered from hell to breakfast. She and her one hired hand, a half-drunk old-timer named Jeb, had spent a week gathering only 12 of them. The second was in Prosperity. Mr. Abernathy, the owner of the general store, suddenly found her credit to be overextended. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he'd muttered, avoiding her eyes as he studied a ledger. Mr. Thorne, that is, the railroad, holds the note on my store. He's just asking everyone to tighten their belts. You understand?" She understood. The third complication was Dutch Anderson, a hulking, bearded man who worked as Thorne's foreman. He and his men began frequenting the saloon in Prosperity, bragging loudly that the Widow Miller's land would be railroad property by the first snow. They'd taken to riding the boundary of her property, just watching. Now, as Sarah drove her axe into the stubborn pine, the late October air bit at her face. Winter was coming, and with it, a new kind of dread. She was alone. Every hand in the territory was against her, bought or intimidated by Thorne. That night, the wind howled. It wasn't the low moan of a prairie breeze. It was the high-pitched shriek of a true blizzard. Snow, impossibly early and violent, began to plaster the cabin. It came from the north, a solid wall of white that erased the world. Sarah bolted the door, stoked the fire, and sat with Jacob's old 1873 Winchester across her lap. The storm was a new enemy, but it felt like an old one, just another part of this land trying to kill her. She must have dozed, lulled by the roar of the wind, because the sound that woke her was not part of the storm. It was a thud. It came from the lean-to on the side of the cabin, where she kept her milk cow. Bessie. It was a human sound, a fall. She grabbed the rifle, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Dutch Anderson. Had Thorne sent his men to do in the dark what he couldn't do in the light? She eased the door open. The wind ripped it from her hand, slamming it against the cabin wall. A vortex of ice and snow filled the room, extinguishing her lantern. "Who's there?" she screamed into the white chaos. Another sound, a groan, not from the wind. She relit the lantern, wrapped her shawl tight, and pushed her way out, leaning into the blizzard. The world was gone. There was only the cabin wall and the 6 feet of swirling snow her light could penetrate. She found him by the lean-to. He wasn't Dutch, he was Cheyenne. He was collapsed, face down, a drift already forming against his back. He wore hide leggings and a buffalo coat, all of it stiff with frozen blood. He was young, but his face was contorted in a mask of agony. A deep, ragged gash ran down his leg, and a darker, uglier stain blossomed on his side. He was a fugitive. Sarah knew it instantly. The army had been sweeping the Bighorn for renegades who had jumped the reservation. Sheriff Brody had posters up in Prosperity. Wanted for the murder of a U.S. Army surveyor. $100. Hostile. She looked at the man. He was dying. He turned his head, his eyes barely slitted open. They were black, deep, and filled with a desperate, animal-like fire. He tried to reach for the knife at his belt, but his hand fell uselessly. Sarah stood there, the blizzard tearing at her, the lantern light flickering on the dying man. Hostile. Her mind screamed, "Leave him! He's not your problem. He's a dead man. Helping him is a crime. Thorne will use this. He'll say you're harboring savages. He'll have the army here. He'll have you burned out." The man's chest gave a shuddering rattle. A weak cough brought a pink froth to his lips. He was going to die. Right here, by her cow. "Damn it," Sarah whispered to the wind. "Damn Jacob for dying. Damn Thorne for living. And damn this land for everything." She put the rifle down. She grabbed the man under his arms. He was lighter than he looked. His strength bled out into the snow. But he was still a dead weight. "You live," she grunted, pulling him. "And you are going to be the death of me." She dragged the dying Cheyenne fugitive over the threshold and slammed the door against the storm. The cabin was small, a main room with a fireplace, a small bedroom where she slept, and a root cellar beneath a trap door in the floor. There was nowhere to hide a man. The fugitive, she didn't know his name, was a mess of frozen blood, mud, and snow. She laid him on the bearskin rug before the fire, the rug Jacob had treasured. The man was unconscious, his breathing shallow and fast. Sarah was a practical woman, not a nurse. She'd set Jacob's broken leg once, but this was different. This was butchery. She cut away the hide leggings and the shirt. The wound in his side was a ragged, puckered hole, blue around the edges. A bullet wound, old by at least 2 days. It was deeply infected. The gash on his leg was from a fall, likely from a horse, but it was the bullet that was killing him. She heated the poker in the fire until it glowed cherry red. She poured Jacob's last bottle of whiskey, half for the wound, half for her own shaking hands. The man's eyes snapped open when the alcohol hit the wound. He didn't scream. He made a low, guttural sound, his entire body arching off the floor. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like a steel trap, even in his weakness. "Let go," she hissed, trying to pull free. His eyes, burning with fever, locked on hers. They were filled with a wild, profound hatred. Not for her, she realized, but for the pain, for the situation. "I am helping you," she said, enunciating each word. He held her wrist for a long, terrifying moment, the smell of burning flesh and whiskey filling the room as she held the hot poker to the wound. He stared at her, as if trying to memorize her face, and then he collapsed back, unconscious. She worked for hours. She dug the bullet out with her skinning knife, a .45 caliber slug, probably from a US Army Colt. She stitched the wound shut with horsehair and a fishhook needle. She packed the leg gash with a poultice of yarrow and spider webs, an old remedy Jeb had taught her. All the while, the blizzard raged. It was a perfect cover. No one would be riding in this. When she was done, she faced a new problem. He couldn't stay by the fire. Anyone who came to her door, Jeb, Mr. Abernathy, God forbid, Dutch Anderson, would see him. The cellar. It was cold, but it was dry. She dragged blankets, her own quilts, down into the darkness. Then, with effort that left her gasping, she moved the man. She lowered him into the cellar and pulled the trapdoor shut, covering it with the bearskin rug. For 3 days, the blizzard was her jailer and her savior. The wind screamed, and Sarah Miller lived a double life. By day, she was the lonely widow, tending her cow, clearing snow from her door, keeping the fire high. But every few hours, she would lock the door, pull back the rug, and descend into the cold dark. The fugitive's fever was a living thing. He thrashed, crying out in a language that was all harsh consonants and soft vowels. He spoke of his mother, his sister, a name that sounded like Hosa. He spoke of fire and soldiers. She spooned broth and willow bark tea into his mouth. She changed his bandages in the dim lantern light. He was strong. His body fought the poison. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. She was changing the dressing on his side when his eyes opened. This time they were clear. He was weak, but he was sane. He watched her. His gaze was intense, unnerving. "Water," he whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. She brought it. He drank greedily. "Who are you?" he asked, his English halting but clear. "Sarah Miller. This is my ranch." He looked around the small, dirt-walled cellar. "Why? Why what? Why? Help." Sarah paused. She looked at the man who was wanted for murder, the man who was her enemy by every law in this territory. "The storm, I suppose," she said, finally. "And I didn't much like the idea of a man dying in my yard. It's untidy." A flicker of something, amusement, crossed his face. It was gone in an instant. "My name is Hosa." "Hosa," she repeated. "Little raven." His eyes widened slightly, surprised she knew the translation. "You're the one they're hunting," she stated. It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly. "They say I killed a soldier, a surveyor." "Did you?" He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Yes. He was desecrating a burial site, my sister's. He put his map on her grave. He laughed." Hosa's hands clenched into fists on the blanket. "So I killed him." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cellar. The stark, simple honesty of it. There was no remorse, only justification. "They'll hang you," she said. "If they find me," Hosa replied. The silence stretched. The only sound was the drip of melting snow from the roof above. "You have to leave," she said. "The storm is breaking. My hired hand, Jeb, he'll be by. And others. Men who work for Elias Thorne." "Thorne?" Hosa said. The name was a question. "He wants my land. He's trying to push me out." Hosa was quiet for a long time. "The man with the polished boots. He brings the Iron Snake, the Blackwater and Pacific." Sarah was stunned. "How do you know that?" "He spoke with the surveyor I killed. They are partners. They want the water. Your water." He looked up at the cellar ceiling. "They want the water that runs under this floor." Sarah hadn't known. Jacob's Spring was just the surface of a much larger aquifer. Hosa's people knew this land in a way she never could. "He will not stop," Hosa said. "He will use your kindness to me as a weapon against you. He doesn't know you're here." "He will." Hosa tried to sit up, wincing as his side pulled. "I must go. Tonight. You're not strong enough. You'll die out there." "I will die here," Hosa said, his eyes hard. "If the man named Thorne finds me here, he will have an excuse to burn this house. He will say you shelter. Renegades. He will bring the army. You will lose everything. My debt is to you. I will not be the cause of your ruin." He was right. She knew he was right. That night, she gave him Jacob's winter coat, a loaf of bread, and a strip of salted beef. She led him from the cellar. At the door, he paused. He was still weak, leaning heavily on the frame. "Your enemies," he said, "are my enemies. The man Thorne. He cuts the earth, and he does not heal it. This is a bad thing." "Be safe, Hosa," she said. He reached out and, with one finger, lightly touched the wooden door frame. A simple gesture, but it felt like a promise. "A debt is owed, Sarah Miller," he said. Then he stepped out into the moonlit snow and vanished into the shadows of the pines. Sarah watched him go until the cold drove her back inside. She scrubbed the floor where he had bled, put the rug back over the trap door, and prayed that the secret would stay buried. Hosa's departure left a void in the cabin, an echo of secrecy. But the land had no time for echoes. The winter of 1876 was brutal, a relentless assault of ice and wind. Sarah survived it on stubbornness and meager portions, her small herd of cattle reduced to 9 by the time the thaw came. Elias Thorne had waited out the winter. He, like a patient predator, let the cold do his work for him. When the first crocuses pushed through the mud, he returned. He didn't come with offers this time. He came with men. The new complication was a man named Silas Croft. He wasn't a railroad man. He was a Pinkerton agent, hired by the Blackwater and Pacific for security. Croft was the opposite of Dutch Anderson. Where Anderson was a loud, barroom bully, Croft was a quiet, thin man with pale eyes and a neat mustache. He looked like a clerk, but he moved with a cold, reptilian efficiency. Sarah met him in prosperity. She was trying to argue with Mr. Abernathy for a line of credit for seed grain. "Mrs. Miller," Croft's voice cut through the store. He tipped his bowler hat. "Silas Croft. I'm handling security for the B&P's surveying team. I was just reviewing some old cases. You're familiar with the army warrants from last fall?" The store went quiet. "I'm not," Sarah lied, her blood turning to ice. "Oh?" Croft smiled, a small, tight expression. "A renegade Cheyenne. Murdered a surveyor. William Croft." Sarah's breath caught. "My younger brother, in fact," Silas Croft continued, his voice conversational. "The army trackers. They followed his trail, right into that blizzard last October. And the trail went cold, right about here." He tapped a map on Abernathy's counter, his finger landing squarely on the parcel, marked J. Miller, 300 acres. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Croft," Sarah said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "I'm implying nothing, madam. Just observing. It's a miracle the savage survived that storm. Unless, of course, he had help." He stared at her. The whole town was staring. Mr. Abernathy suddenly found something to polish under the counter. "If you'll excuse me," Sarah said, leaving the seed grain. She fled the store, Croft's pale eyes following her all the way out. The squeeze began in earnest. It was no longer about cut fences. This was methodical. A week later, Dutch Anderson and his men began constructing a line camp just outside her property, but directly upstream on the dry creek. Within 2 days, her crystal-clear spring water turned cloudy and foul. She rode up, her Winchester in its scabbard. Anderson and 5 other men were skinning buffalo, tossing the offal and hides directly into the creek. "Get that filth out of my water," Sarah shouted. Dutch Anderson grinned, wiping his bloody hands on his trousers. "Morning, Mrs. Miller. Just cleaning our kill. This ain't your land. This here is railroad land. We can do as we please." "You're poisoning my spring." "Is that a fact?" Anderson said, picking his teeth. "Water looks fine to me. Maybe you're just sensitive." She knew she was beaten. She couldn't take on 6 armed men. She rode back, her stomach in knots. Her cattle wouldn't drink from the spring. She was forced to haul barrels from the well in Prosperity, a 20-mile round trip, just to keep her animals, and herself, from being poisoned. Next, it was the fires. "Small prairie fires," Thorne explained to Sheriff Brody. "Caused by our survey crews, I'm afraid. Sparks from their instruments. Terribly sorry." But the fires were never on her land. They were always just on the edge, burning away the grass her cattle needed, forcing her to buy expensive hay from Abernathy, who was now charging her double, cash on delivery. Jeb, her old hired hand, finally quit. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he'd said, twisting his hat. "But Dutch Anderson told me. He said any man working for you is a man working against the railroad. He said accidents happen. He wouldn't meet her eye. This land ain't worth dying for." He left his pay on the table and walked away. Sarah was truly alone. The summer was a dusty hell. She was thin, her hands were cracked and bleeding, and her spirit was fraying. Thorne and Croft rode out one afternoon in August. The heat was oppressive, the sky a baked white sheet. "Mrs. Miller," Thorne said, dismounting. He was, as always, immaculate in a dark suit. "You look tired." Silas Croft didn't dismount. He just sat on his horse, watching her with those dead, pale eyes. "What do you want, Thorne?" Sarah said, holding Jacob's shotgun. It was heavy, but she held it steady. "My offer has changed," Thorne said. "The company feels 500 was too generous, given your uncooperative nature and the suspicions that have been raised." He gestured to Croft. "Mr. Croft here is a federal agent, in a manner of speaking. He believes you may have aided a federal fugitive, a murderer. That's a hanging offense, Mrs. Miller. harboring a renegade. "I don't know what you're talking about," she spat. "No?" Thorne smiled. "Well, the good news is, I can make all this unpleasantness go away. The fires, the rumors, Mr. Croft's investigation." He pulled a document from his saddlebag. $100. For the deed. You'll be on the eastbound stage tomorrow morning. You can start fresh. St. Louis, perhaps. Chicago. A woman like you. You're still young enough. $100. It was the final humiliation. "You can take your $100, Mr. Thorne," Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous, "and you can go to hell." Thorne's face hardened. The mask of civility dropped. "Very well. I tried to be reasonable. You've had your chance." He climbed back on his horse. "We start digging the reservoir diversion next week, Mrs. Miller," he said, turning his horse. "The spring will be dry by September. Let's see how long you last without water or money." He looked at Croft. "Are we done here, Silas?" Croft hadn't taken his eyes off her. "She's hiding something. I can smell it." "She's just a stubborn fool," Thorne said. "No," Croft said, his voice quiet. "She's a liar, and my brother's killer is still out there. They're connected. I know it." He finally looked away from her, turning his horse to follow Thorne. "And I will find him." They rode off, leaving Sarah standing in the dust, the shotgun suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. She sank onto the porch steps, the deed to Jacob's Rest a meaningless piece of paper. They had beaten her. She had nothing left to fight with. Winter was coming again, and she wouldn't survive this one. The next 2 years were not a fight. They were an erosion. Sarah held on, but only just. She sold Jacob's tools, then his saddle, then his pocket watch. She kept her 9 cattle alive, but they were gaunt. The spring ran, but it was tainted. She had dug a shallow well by hand, a back-breaking labor that yielded only bitter, alkaline water. The town of Prosperity was no longer a town, it was a camp. The Blackwater and Pacific had arrived. Hundreds of men, Irish, Chinese, freedmen, and war veterans, had descended on the basin, living in a sprawling, filthy tent city. They were laying the grade for the tracks. The air, once silent, now rang with the sound of hammers, dynamite, and foreign languages. Elias Thorne was no longer just a land agent. He was the de facto king of the territory, the B&P's man on the ground. Sarah's ranch was an island of defiance in the middle of his ocean. The railroad tracks were slated to run less than 100 yards from her property line, but Thorne needed her spring for his water tower. His diversion had failed. The ground was too hard, the water table too deep. He needed to own the source. Her defiance, once a source of pride, now felt like a fool's errand. One hot day in July 1878, a new player arrived. He did not come on horseback or by wagon. He came in a private, opulent railroad car, pulled by a special engine, on the newly laid tracks that now ended just 5 miles from her ranch. His name was Alistair Finch. Finch was the president of the Blackwater and Pacific. He was a man who didn't deal in land, but in continents. He bought senators, started small wars, and viewed the Wyoming Territory as a single line item on a massive budget sheet. He had come west to inspect his investment and to understand why a single, stubborn widow was holding up his timetable. His visit to Sarah's ranch was unannounced. A polished black buggy, looking wildly out of place, rolled up to her cabin. Elias Thorne sat at the reins, looking uncomfortable. In the passenger seat sat a man in a fine silk suit, smoking a cigar. Silas Croft and Dutch Anderson rode as armed outriders. "Mrs. Miller," Thorne called out, his voice tight with false cheer. "May I present Mr. Alistair Finch, President of the Blackwater and Pacific. Finch climbed out of the buggy. He was a short, stocky man with a face like a bulldog and eyes that missed nothing. He ignored Sarah and walked directly to her spring. He dipped a silver cup into the water, sniffed it, took a small sip, and spat it on the ground. "It's tainted," he said, his voice a low growl. "Just upstream, sir," Thorne said quickly. "My man Anderson's camp, easily rectified." "This is her?" Finch said, jabbing his cigar at Sarah. She stood on the porch, her rifle in hand. "This is the Widow Miller, yes, sir." Finch walked to the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. He looked Sarah up and down. "I've read Mr. Thorne's reports. You're a stubborn woman." "It's my land," Sarah said. "It's my railroad," Finch countered. "My railroad will run through this basin. It will have a water tower, and that tower will draw from this spring. These are facts. Everything else is negotiation." He pulled a leather-bound checkbook from his coat. "Thorne, you're an idiot. You offered her $100. You insulted her. You never insult a person you need something from. You buy them." He scribbled in the book with a fountain pen. $5,000. He tore the check out and held it up. Sarah stared at it. $5,000. It was a fortune. It was more money than she had ever seen. It was enough to go anywhere. San Francisco, New York, back east. Thorne's jaw dropped. "Mr. Finch, that's wildly over-market." "Shut up, Elias," Finch snapped. "I am not buying land, I am buying time. My line is stopped. Every day my crew sit idle, I lose $10,000. $5,000 is a bargain." He looked at Sarah. "Take the money, Mrs. Miller. Be rich, or be stubborn. But I'm warning you, my patience is at an end. If you refuse," he glanced at Croft and Anderson, "this situation will be rectified by other means." The threat was bare. He would kill her. He would burn her out and have his men sign affidavits saying it was a prairie fire. This was the end. She could take the money and run, or she could die here for a pile of rocks and tainted water. She looked at Jacob's grave. She looked at the cabin she had built with her own hands. She started. And that's when they heard it. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a vibration, a low, rhythmic drumming that came from the ridge to the north. Dutch Anderson, a veteran of the plains, was the first to react. "What in the hell?" A single rider appeared on the ridgeline, silhouetted against the bright blue sky. Then another, and another. Within a minute, the entire ridge was dark with them. 50, maybe 100 riders. Not army, not cowboys. They were Cheyenne, dog soldiers. They wore war paint. Their lances and rifles glinted in the sun. They sat on their horses, silent, watching. Alistair Finch's cigar fell from his mouth. "Elias, what is this?" Thorne, for the first time, looked terrified. I don't know. The reservation is 200 miles south. They're not supposed to be here." Silas Croft's hand went to his pistol. His pale eyes were wide, fixed on the riders. "Renegades." "They're not renegades," Sarah whispered, her heart pounding against her ribs. One rider detached himself from the group. He began to walk his horse slowly down the slope toward the cabin. He was not the half-dead boy she had pulled from the snow. This was a man. He wore a full, magnificent headdress of eagle feathers that trailed down his back. His chest was crossed with ammunition bandoliers over a beaded vest. He carried a new model repeating rifle in the crook of his arm. His face was painted, a stark, terrifying mask of black and red. But she knew his eyes. He rode into the yard and stopped, his horse a magnificent war pony that dwarfed Thorne's buggy team. Alistair Finch, Thorne, Anderson, and Croft were frozen, The power dynamic in the yard had shifted in 30 seconds. The Warchief looked at the railroad men, his gaze one of utter, cold contempt. Then he looked at Sarah. His face, beneath the paint, was unreadable, but his voice was clear, and it carried across the yard. "Sarah Miller," he said. He had not forgotten her name. "My people are thirsty. We have come for water. From your spring." It was Hosa. The silence that followed Hosa's words was absolute. It was a vacuum, pulling all courage from the railroad men. Dutch Anderson, who had bragged in saloons about clearing out the natives, now seemed to be trying to hide behind his own horse. Elias Thorne, the man of suits and contracts, was as pale as a corpse. Alistair Finch, the tycoon, was doing mental arithmetic, and for the first time in his life, the numbers weren't adding up in his favor. But it was Silas Croft who reacted. His hatred was more powerful than his fear. "That's him!" Croft hissed, his hand drawing his pistol. "That's the savage who killed my brother." Croft raised his gun. "Hosa!" Before he could pull the trigger, two things happened at once. Sarah, who had been standing on the porch, swung the heavy barrel of her shotgun and slammed it hard against Croft's arm. The shot went wide, kicking up dust at Hosa's horse's feet. Simultaneously, a sound ripped through the air, a high, buzzing thwack. A single arrow, black-fletched, appeared in the wooden porch post, an inch from Croft's head. It had come from the ridge. A warning shot. Croft cried out, clutching his arm, his pistol falling to the dirt. Hosa hadn't flinched. His horse hadn't moved. He simply looked at Croft, then at the arrow, then back at Finch. "Your dog is loud," Hosa said. Alistair Finch found his voice. He was a businessman, and this was now a business meeting, a very, very dangerous one. "Sir," Finch said, raising his hands, palms out, "there is a misunderstanding. We are agents of the United States government. We are building a railroad. Under treaty." Hosa dismounted. He was taller than she remembered. The years of hardship had forged him into something formidable. He walked, not to Finch, but to Sarah's spring. His warriors on the ridge sat, unmoving, watching. An army, held in check by a single man. He knelt. He looked at the befouled water, at the offal and scum Dutch Anderson had left. His face tightened. He stood, turned, and walked to Thorne. "You," Hosa said. He pointed at the water. "You did this." It's a line camp," Thorne stammered. Hosa struck him. It wasn't a punch. It was an open-handed slap, a gesture of pure contempt. But it sent the slighter man sprawling into the dust. Dutch Anderson moved, his hand dropping to his gun belt. "Why, you... Dutch!" Finch screamed. Do not!" Hosa ignored Anderson. He stared down at Thorne. "You break the earth. You poison the water. You are a sickness." He turned to Finch. "The treaty. You speak of the treaty. The Fort Laramie Treaty." "That's right," Finch said, trying to regain his composure. "It grants us right of way." "You lie," Hosa said, his voice quiet, but carrying. "You lie." Hosa turned and looked up at the ridge. He gave a sharp cry, a signal. A second rider came down. This man was older, his face a map of wrinkles. He was not a warrior. He was a keeps-the-paint man, a law-keeper. He carried a rawhide satchel. The old man dismounted, and with great ceremony handed Hosa a long, rolled piece of parchment. It was not parchment. It was a hide map, brittle and old. Hosa unfurled it. "This," Hosa said, "is the first map, drawn by the tribes and the army before the liars came. It shows the treaty line," he pointed. "The line is the ridge. North of the creek, this ranch, her ranch," he nodded at Sarah, "is on treaty land. It is Our land. Thorne, scrambling to his feet, burst out. That's preposterous. The official B&P survey, the government survey, clearly states, the government survey, Hosa interrupted, his voice, like ice, was drawn by William Croft. He looked at Silas Croft, whose face was a mask of hate and dawning realization. Your brother, Hosa continued, was not just a surveyor. He was a thief. He did not find the line. He moved it. He moved it for him. Hosa pointed at Finch. To steal this water, to steal this land. He broke the treaty. The desecration of my sister's grave was his celebration. This was the twist, the great, terrible secret. Hosa hadn't just murdered a man in a fit of rage. He had executed a man for breaking a federal treaty. The fugitive was the only one who had been honoring the law. And I have his map, Hosa said. He tapped the B&P survey map that Silas Croft had been carrying, the one he'd dropped when Sarah hit him. The false one. The one he died for. Alistair Finch stared, his mind racing. A treaty violation. Not a local squabble, not a murder, but a federal treaty violation. This would bring the army. Not just a local detachment, but the full weight of the War Department. It would mean investigations, inquiries, senators asking questions. It would mean delays. It could bankrupt his entire line. Mr. Finch, Thorne said, his voice desperate. He's lying. It's a trick. He's a savage. Finch looked at Thorne with the eyes of a man looking at a cockroach. Elias, he said, you have, for the last time, made a mess of my railroad. He looked at Hosa. What do you want? Money? Cattle? Hosa shook his head. We want the line. We want the treaty. Honored. The Iron Snake will not cross the ridge, and it will not drink from this water. He then looked at Sarah. And she stays. This is her land. She is a friend. She keeps the water. You will not touch her. And Thorne? Silas Croft spat, his face purple. What about him? He's a land agent. What about Anderson? They're just employees. This is the murderer of my brother. I want him. Hosa looked at Croft. For the first time, a dark, cold anger showed in his eyes. You want me? Hosa said. Then, come. He turned his back on Croft, a deliberate, profound insult, and walked to his horse. The standoff was set. Hosa and his warriors set up camp on the ridge. They didn't attack. They didn't raid. They watched. For 3 days, the B&P work crews sat idle. Finch was in his rail car, telegraphing Washington, his fury mounting. The railroad was stopped. And in the middle, in the cabin on Dry Creek, sat Sarah Miller. Hosa's warriors were on the ridge. Thorne's hired guns were in the railroad camp. She was trapped between two armies, the cause of a war she never asked for. On the third night, Thorne, realizing his career was over, decided to rectify the situation himself. If he couldn't have the land, no one would. Alistair Finch was a pragmatist. A war with the Cheyenne, an investigation by the Department of the Interior, these were expenses. He had already telegraphed his partners in Washington. The official B&P survey, he explained, had encountered an unexpected topographical anomaly. They would be rerouting the line 5 miles to the south. It would cost $1 million, but it was cheaper than a war. He had personally and coldly informed Elias Thorne that his employment with the Blackwater and Pacific was terminated. You've cost me a fortune, Elias, Finch had said, closing the door of his private car. I suggest you be on the next train east. If the Cheyenne don't kill you, I might. But Thorne wasn't a man who accepted defeat. He was a man consumed by his own small, poisonous pride. He had lost his job, his reputation, and the land he'd spent years trying to acquire. He blamed the widow. He blamed the savage. He found Dutch Anderson and the half-dozen men loyal to him, not to the railroad, but to the paycheck Thorne had provided. And he found Silas Croft. "He's getting away," Thorne snarled, pacing in the dark of the B&P tent city. "Finch is letting him win." "This ain't our fight no more, boss," Dutch said, nervously eyeing the ridge, where the Cheyenne campfires glowed like a constellation of angry stars. "It's my fight," Thorne said. "And yours, Croft. He's right there, the man who killed your brother. Are you going to let him ride away, laughing?" Silas Croft's pale face was illuminated by the lantern. "I'm not. I don't care about the railroad. I don't care about the treaty. I want him." "Then here's the plan," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We can't take the whole ridge, but we don't need to. We take the bait." He looked toward Sarah's cabin. "We burn her out, for real this time. In the chaos, Hosa will come for her. He has to. He made a big show of protecting her. When he comes down, you get your shot, Croft, and I get my satisfaction." "Burn her out," Dutch said. "What about the horses? The woman?" "I don't care," Thorne hissed. "Burn it all." The attack came an hour before dawn. Sarah was asleep, but it was the sleep of the hunted. A board on her porch creaked. It wasn't the wind. She was out of bed, her shotgun in hand, as the first torch-fueled whiskey bottle smashed against the barn wall. The whoosh of igniting kerosene lit up the yard. "Fire! Fire!" she screamed, though there was no one to hear her. She burst onto the porch. Dutch Anderson was at the barn, splashing more oil. 2 other men were riding toward her small herd, and Thorne, on horseback, sat in the middle of the yard, a torch in his hand, his face a demonic mask. "This is progress, Mrs. Miller," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "This is what you get for being stubborn." He threw the torch. It landed on the cabin's dry, shake roof. A bullet snapped past Sarah's head. From the darkness near the creek bed, Silas Croft spoke. "That's her! Now where is he?" The ridge exploded. It wasn't a charge. It was a calculated, immediate response. A high, ululating cry echoed down the basin. Hosa had been waiting. He knew Thorne. He knew men like him. The Cheyenne warriors, Hosa at their head, didn't ride for the cabin. They rode to cut off Thorne's retreat. They poured out of the darkness, a wave of ghostly, painted riders. The battle for Dry Creek Ranch had begun. It was chaos. Dutch Anderson, seeing the warriors, fumbled for his rifle. A warrior, riding low on his pony, put an arrow through Anderson's chest. The big man fell, his own torch igniting the hay he'd scattered. Thorne, screaming in terror, spurred his horse back toward the railroad camp, but 2 Cheyenne riders intercepted him, forcing him back toward the burning cabin. Sarah, meanwhile, was in her own fight. The roof was on fire, but Silas Croft was her immediate problem. "Come out, widow!" Croft yelled from the darkness. "Come out and watch your savage friend die!" He fired again. The bullet splintered the doorframe. Sarah dropped to the floor, smoke filling the cabin. She had to move. She crawled to the back window, the one that led to the root cellar. She kicked it out, scrambled through, and rolled into the dirt, shotgun in hand. The yard was a nightmare of smoke, orange light, and screaming men. Hosa's warriors were dispatching Thorne's remaining men with brutal efficiency. She saw Croft. He wasn't looking for her. He was crouched behind the water trough, his rifle aimed at the center of the fight, waiting for Hosa. And then he saw him. Hosa, his horse shot out from under him, was on foot. He had a war hatchet in one hand and a knife in the other. He was dueling with one of Thorne's men. "I have you," Croft whispered, raising his rifle. He had a clear shot. "No," Sarah said. She raised the shotgun. She was too far for the buckshot to be deadly, but it didn't need to be. She fired both barrels at the water trough. The sound was deafening. The trough, An old metal tub exploded, sending a shower of splinters, pellets and foul water into Croft's face. He screamed, blinded, dropping his rifle. Hosa finished his opponent and looked up, seeing Sarah and the blinded Croft. He started to move toward them. "Hosa!" It was Thorn. He had been cornered. His horse was gone. He stood, wild-eyed, his fine suit in tatters, holding a pistol. He was 50 feet away. This is all your fault!" he shrieked at Hosa. "You, savage! You ruined everything!" Hosa stopped. He stood between Sarah and Thorn. He held only his hatchet. Thorn raised his pistol. Sarah was reloading her shotgun, her hands shaking so badly she dropped the shells. "No! No! Thorn!" A new voice boomed. Alistair Finch, in his nightshirt, was standing in his buggy on the edge of the property, flanked by 2 of his own armed guards. "Elias, stand down! It's over!" Thorn just laughed, a high, broken sound. "It's over. When he's dead." He leveled the pistol at Hosa's chest. There was a single, sharp crack. Elias Thorn's eyes went wide. He looked down at his chest, at the small red hole that had appeared. He looked up at Sarah, his face a mask of confusion. He fell forward into the dust. Sarah stood on the porch, Jacob's old hunting rifle, not the shotgun, in her hands. The barrel was smoking. She had been a good shot. Jacob had taught her. Hosa turned. He looked at Thorn, dead in the dirt. He looked at Sarah, standing on the porch of her burning cabin, the rifle in her hands. He nodded. Once. A sign of respect. A debt paid in full, by both of them. The yard went silent, save for the crackle of the flames. Hosar's warriors had finished. The rest of Thorn's men were dead or had fled. The sun began to crest the Bighorn Mountains, casting a bloody red light over the smoking, ruined ranch. The fire was consuming the cabin. The barn was already a pile of glowing embers. Hosa walked to Sarah. He stood before her, the Warchief and the widow, covered in soot and smoke. "He would have killed you," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. "Yes," Hosa said. "You saved my life." "You saved mine," she countered. "When you came back." Hosa looked at the burning cabin. "You have no home." "It was just wood," Sarah said, a strange, cold calm settling over her. "It was a prison." Alistair Finch approached, stepping carefully over the body of one of Thorn's men. He looked at the devastation, at Hosa and at Sarah. He was a man who knew how to cut his losses. "A tragic misunderstanding," Finch said, his voice smooth. "My agent, Mr. Thorn, clearly went insane. A rogue employee. Mr. Croft, also a rogue. A tragedy for all involved." He looked at Hosa. "The railroad will honor the treaty line, the ridge. My surveyors will be corrected." Hosa stared at him. "And her?" Finch looked at Sarah. He saw the rifle. He saw the body of Elias Thorn. He saw the 50 warriors on the ridge, now watching him. "Mrs. Miller," Finch said, "is a valued member of this community, a victim of Mr. Thorn's madness." He pulled out his checkbook, the one he had offered her before. "The Blackwater and Pacific feels responsible for the actions of its rogue agent. This damage must be compensated." He scribbled, his hand shaking slightly. He tore out the check. $10,000 for the damages and for your silence on the nature of this dispute. Sarah looked at the check. It was not a bribe. It was a surrender. "I will also," Finch added, "be posting a permanent B&P security detail in Prosperity. My men, not his." He nodded at Thorn. "They will have strict instructions that Jacob's Rest and its owner are to be protected as a friend of the railroad." It was the best he could offer. A truce. Sarah took the check. Hosa and his warriors stayed for a week. They did not stay as an army. They stayed as neighbors. They helped Sarah water her cattle. They hunted deer and left cuts of venison on her porch. They posted silent sentries on the ridge while the first B&P work crews, under Mr. Finch's personal supervision, began building her a new cabin. Finch was true to his word. He was building the cabin twice as large as the old one, with lumber shipped in from Oregon. It was his insurance policy. On the morning Hosa was to leave, he came to her. Not as a war chief, but as the man she had pulled from the snow. He wore simple buckskins. "We go south," he said. "The army has agreed to the treaty line, for now." "Will it last?" she asked. Hosa looked at the new, raw lumber frame of her house, at the railroad camp in the distance. "No, but today, it is good." They stood by the spring. It was already running cleaner. "You are safe here, Sarah Miller," he said. "Finch is a snake. But Hubsars, he is a snake who fears you. You are the widow who killed the agent, and who has the Cheyenne as friends. You are a power, now." She had never thought of it that way. "And you, Hosa?" she asked. "Are you safe?" He gave that small, rare smile she had seen once in the cellar. "I am Hosa." It was all the answer he could give. He put his hand out, palm to palm with hers. Not a handshake, a connection. His hand was rough, calloused. Hers was, too. "A debt is owed," he said, repeating his words from that snowy night. "The debt is paid, Hosa," she replied. "No," he said, his eyes serious. "A debt, like this, is never paid. It is carried." He mounted his horse. He looked at her one last time, at the new cabin, at the land he had saved, and the woman who had saved him. He turned his horse and rode toward the ridge, joining his men. Sarah watched him until he was just a speck, until he blended with the land and was gone. She turned back to her new life. She had the check, she had the land, and she had the memory. She was Sarah Miller, the widow of Dry Creek, and she was no longer alone. In the Old West, survival was a daily fight. But as Sarah Miller learned, the deepest debts aren't paid with money, but with courage. She saved a man's life, and in return, he saved her world. Theirs was a story of a debt carried, an alliance forged in blood and blizzards, one that proved that even in the most lawless of times, loyalty was the only law that mattered. The B&P Railroad eventually found another way, but Jacob's Rest remained. A small patch of land, protected not by a deed, but by the powerful memory of a promise kept. Thank you for watching this story from the forgotten pages of the West. If you felt the chill of that Wyoming winter and the heat of that final battle, please do us a favor. Hit that like button to let us know. Subscribe for more true-life tales of grit, survival, and the untold drama of the American frontier. And don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a great story. Let us know in the comments. Who was the real hero of this story? Sarah or Hosa? We'll see you on the next trail.